something which historians wouldn't normally do, because I talk about the consequences of the 2015 refugee crisis. This is, of course, something that, from a historical point of view, you couldn't really analyze very well because you don't have the archive access. But as I said, the material for this comes from the network, and I think it is interesting for historians also to reflect on these issues, because it can put into question how historians approach the process of European integration. This is one of my hypotheses, that this crisis reveals a false rhetoric in the historiography of European integration, and I think that is quite important. Now, I will focus on borders and migration policies, and so the presentations this morning were quite complementary, because you were talking about the external agreements with Turkey, for example, mainly, and I will not deal with these issues, and more with the internal questions of the border and the migration crisis. Now, as I said before, the 2015 migration crisis has actually questioned this idea of a Europe without borders, which is an idea linked, I will come back to this, with the idea of European integration as it was put in place after 1945. In order to explain this and the consequences for the border and migration policies, I would like to talk about three points. The first point is, well, what is that Europe without borders for the Europeans or for the EU? What is the effect of the migration crisis on this concept and on the concept on the border policies? And then what is the effect of the migration crisis on the migration policies? Whereas the third point, of course, is a huge subject which I could only touch upon briefly and which would have to be developed much more, because it is a national issue and you would have to actually deal with all the 28 or soon 27 member states and their policies in order to really grasp the effect of this. And now, in the history of European integration, the border has been identified as a scar of history, something which has to be healed, a symbol also of separation, and for the European economic community, mainly an economic obstacle. That's how the Europeanists actually saw the border after 1945, an obstacle to overcome. So everything about European integration was about taking away borders, whereas the European scholars have not actually seen enough how what a border is, in fact, and that a border has several functions, and that a border, for example, can also have positive functions. That was not taken into account in this ideal of the Europe without borders. Now, the first and foremost objective of the European Economic Community, set up in 1957, was no trade barriers, and so to increase mobility. So Europe without trade barriers, which was for them the basis or the necessary condition in order to get economic growth and prosperity in Europe. So this is the basis. It starts actually in 1950 with a European coal and steel community, the famous Schuman Plan, which he announced and which put forward this idea of taking away borders, economic borders. When the EEC was founded in 1957, the idea of taking away economic borders went even a bit further, because the Treaty of Rome contains the element of a common market, which means that you have internally no economic borders, and externally you put into place a common external tariff, so a common economic border towards the exterior. The idea is, of course, to have a free circulation of goods, and therefore to foster also the economic development, which in the 1950s was becoming really well in the European community, but in some states, mainly Germany, for example, better than in others. This was the whole idea of the economic borderless Europe. It became then, I make a big jump in the history, but with my favorite President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, when he became president of the European Commission, his idea was to create a single European market, which included more than just the trade barriers to put away. His main objective was actually the European monetary union, so it was about monetary barriers, and there were the so-called four freedoms. It was free circulation of goods, that was already accomplished, but also services, capital, and people. And people in an economic sense of people. So we are not talking about migrants in an economic sense, that the free circulation of people in order to move around freely in the European community, in order to study, to find a job, to establish themselves, and to work without having any discrimination. That's the idea of the single European market, which also has an effect on migration, because once the migrants, for example, come into the European community, and if you have a borderless Europe, that means that normally they should have the right to circulate also freely within that European community. These rights have been largely restricted also after 2015 as one of the consequences, but theoretically this space is a space for everybody, not only for EC citizens. If one country accepts a migrant, then they should also be able to move freely throughout the European community. The free circulation of people in a citizen way of thinking means that you can cross the border without showing your passport. So it's not the economic interpretation of the free borders, but it's an idea that the people can circulate without having to show any identity papers, no control of your identity. It means you have a common European citizenship. And this is also in relation with the migration crisis very important, because it means that normally within the so-called Schengen area, I'll come back to that, you don't have any border controls. And so this puts a question mark to security issues, and once somebody comes into the European Union or the Schengen area, then you have no means normally to establish systematic controls at the national borders. But that's not the single European market, but that's in fact the Schengen Agreement. Now the Schengen Agreement, and this is very interesting from a historical point of view, has been developed outside the framework of the treaties of the European Community. It was first initiated by 5 member states, Benelux, France and Germany, in 1985, and it took them 10 years to implement that agreement between them. So their idea, this was, in fact, they had the idea to put into place the Schengen Agreement in order to improve the implementation of the single European market. You can find that we have done archival work on this. You can find in the archives that the motivation was an economic motivation in order to put into place this Schengen Agreement at the start. Facilitate the implementation of the single European market, but it meant that there were no more personality or passport security checks. And it is interesting to see that these 5 member states have gone forward with this partial integration, and that then this agreement was integrated after its entering into force into the EU framework, and that was done in 1997 with the Amsterdam Treaty. And that means that when the Amsterdam Treaty came into force, normally all member states should have joined the Schengen Agreement if they were not already in the agreement, like Benelux, France and Germany. However, this becomes complicated in the 1990s because we are after the Maastricht Treaty, and we are after the so-called beginning of the Euroscepticist area, when certain member states, mainly the United Kingdom, but also others, for example Denmark, have acquired the possibility to do some opting out of the monetary union, but also opting out of the Schengen Agreement. And this is why not everybody in the EU is part of Schengen, and this is also, and this is the only European agreement where that is possible. You have the possibility also to join external states to the Schengen Agreement. So this is why, for example, Switzerland, in my border region, Switzerland has become part of Schengen, and so there are no border controls between France, Germany and Switzerland any longer. So this makes it a rather complex agreement, and it's all important for the migration crisis, because these border checks have consequences for the migrants who come in, and you can then, for example, move freely also between France and Switzerland. And so we had some presentations in Strasbourg in January about the difficulties that the Swiss have in order to deal with this problem of they are part of Schengen, but how do they deal with the migrants that could come without border checks into the Swiss Confederation. The fact that you have this Schengen Agreement and it's integrated in the European treaties means that the European Union did need to have a common management of not only internal borders, the free space internally, but also of the external borders, of course. It was not a willingness. This explains the reticence of some member states of the European Union today to develop more integrationist migrational policies, do example. It was not their willingness to have a common approach on this subject, but it was just an obligation. They just couldn't do otherwise, because if you let people move freely within one area, then you have to secure the external border. So it's for security reason, and this meant that the European Union had to do something about asylum seekers, because if you had to kind of find a way how to deal with these asylum seekers who can enter in the European Union and then move around freely without being checked. And the first basis for these external border management, you can find it actually already in the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. It's the third pillar on internal cooperation, police and judicial cooperation. And there you find this is the basis for also then for Schengen and for all the tools of Schengen and of the so-called Dublin Agreement. The Dublin Agreement is for the external borders. Now you can see the Schengen area here. You can see over here, this is an old one because Switzerland is not yet integrated. And you can see that the space is a large space covered in this Schengen area, but there's one particularity, and this makes it so interesting to see that the UK has left mainly because of the migration crisis, is that the UK has never been part of Schengen, and so all the border checks for the UK are not done, are done in France, right, before, and in fact the French do the work for the British, and so so their rhetoric about all these migrants coming in was really a false argument used by people like Nigel Farage, and being very successful with this rhetoric. So this is the most interesting opt-out of the Schengen area. You do, of course, have some of the Eastern and Central European states who are not yet in the Schengen area because in order to integrate the Schengen area, you need to also adopt all the tools, which means, for example, the Schengen Information System, and that needs some preparation, and so it takes some time. But they are supposed to join the Schengen area. Now, the tools of Schengen are 1998 Europol. This is the police force of the European Union. Eurojust. This is the legal cooperation. And where you also have, for example, I don't know, this in English, the mandat d'arrêt européen, the European warrant, which allows for a criminal to be picked up wherever he moves around in the European Union. And you have the so-called Schengen Information System. And when I heard your talk about the cooperation for exchange of information, I think this is also a weak element of the whole Schengen functioning, because it doesn't really work very well. The national states are still very reluctant to give information, to put the information freely into the Schengen information system. What we have to say, though, when we talk about migration crisis, is that there is no direct link with the migration policies. This is to deal with the internal free space of borders. The migration just comes into it because the migrant comes into that space. And so that's because sometimes it's completely mixed up but in the heads of people. They think that migration is only linked to Schengen. No, Schengen normally is not linked to migration. It's just if you put back border controls in place, then you have a problem with the Schengen Agreement. For the management of the external borders, you have the Dublin Agreement, but you also have since 2004 the Frontex force, which is the agency which is financed by the EU, but there has been, I think they have just adopted a reform of Frontex to give it a little bit more means, financial means, because it needs a lot of means in order to be efficient, because this is surveying especially maritime borders. So it's financed by the member states of the European Union, but not on an obligatory basis. It's a free will participation, and it's supposed to be a shared responsibility. But in fact, Frontex has been mainly been a burden for those countries who are confronted with the sea migration, Greece, Italy, for example, and it has not been sufficient. So the Italians, for example, had to complement Frontex forces with their own maritime operations in order to protect the sea border. And this is probably also one of the reasons why we have the migration crisis, is because this tool is not sufficiently developed. The Dublin Convention has been adopted the first. We are now at the negotiation of the fourth Dublin regulation. The Dublin regulation was first adopted in 1990, and there are some non-member states who apply also the Dublin regulation. So this means that sometimes the European external border is shifted in order to deal with the problem of asylum seekers. This is mainly the case, for example, for some microstates which find themselves on the territory of the European Union and are so small, so they join the Dublin Conventions in order to because they're right in the middle of the territory of the European Union. This Dublin Agreement came into force in 1997. At the same point when the Schengen Agreement was integrated into the treaties, and this is you have already mentioned how it works. It means in principle that the first country entry principle is stated in that Dublin Convention, meaning that when an asylum seeker arrives at the border of the European Union, it's the country where he arrives that you have to deal with that asylum seeker. And this, it seems logical, but at the same time it's very unfair, in the sense that it puts, of course, there again the burden on the external states, of those where points of entry where the asylum seekers actually arrive. This also has not a direct link with migration policies, and I always like to emphasize it because the migration policies then are national competences. It's just the management of the external border. You have to deal with the asylum seeker at the external border, but once the asylum seeker comes into the European Union, then how you deal with the asylum seeker or with the migrant is actually something that depends on the national policies, and this means that some member states have very favorable conditions for migrants, asylum seekers, and some do have very unfavorable conditions. And the migrants know, and the asylum seekers know very well where to go to find the beneficial situation for them. If I come now to my second point, meaning the migration crisis, I would like to emphasize the fact that the crisis, everybody would in the media talk about the 2015 migration crisis. This, of course, was a peak. It's true, the peak was caused by our Chancellor Angela Merkel, who said, "Wir schaffen das," and caused an enormous inflow of asylum seekers in 2015. But in fact, the pressure of migration on the European Union considerably increased already after the Arab Spring in 2010. That was kind of one of the main factors. And so the problem already existed before 2015. You can see here the inflow, of course, from this area here into where the Arab Spring was, into the European Union. And the problem is that 2010 to 2015, this migration pressure was completely ignored by the European Union. there was no debate on how to deal with it. And so I would say that 2015, the migration crisis, was already a consequence of this non-dealing on a European level with the migration crisis, rather than the beginning of the crisis. You have, of course, two types of inflow of refugee and migrant seekers into the EU, the irregular and the regular ones. And the problem, of course, is always the irregular ones. And if you look at the problems of irregular immigration, Spain has been, through Gibraltar, been concerned by this subject for years and years. And also, of course, in Italy, for example, via Lampedusa. So you have this phenomenon of illegal migrants, which has been something in the air since the 2000s, and you could actually literally see it at the shores of between the United Kingdom and France, in the so-called jungle of Calais, where all the illegal migrants arrive because they want to go into the United Kingdom, and they camp there, and they are illegal, they are not even allowed to be there. The French authorities decided in the end to take away this camp. But then they put up their tents elsewhere. I mean, we actually visited in one of our border conferences these camps or from the outside these camps into this jungle, and it's very impressive. So the problem was already there. Of course, it creates a huge humanitarian disaster. Nobody talks about, even now, after the migration crisis. The humanitarian effect of that crisis is completely underestimated and not talked about. The dead bodies on the shores of Italy, which cannot be buried because they officially don't exist. The deaths in the sea. Now you talk more about that aspect of the problem. The jungle in Calais. These human rights questions are not dealt with at all. I mean, you have two possible organizations which could deal with these problems. The Human Rights Court in Strasbourg does deal, but only with individual complaints. And then you have the Charter of Human Rights of the European Union, but it has no, as you said, the monitoring is completely, you said about the monitoring is completely missing. You have no technique to make sure that people who have been violated in their human rights can address the EU in order to get repayment for their sufferings. And so this is it means that the migration crisis is for the European Union also an ethical crisis, a crisis of values, because you start adopting values for your own, put forward values for your own citizens inside the European Union, but when it comes to the migrants, they don't even exist, they do not have the same rights, and that's just not possible. But nobody really actually talks about it because I think they don't know how to solve this problem. The problem of the tools to deal with the crisis is that the Frontex mission were not sufficient, so they have to be complemented by other. You have Poseidon, Triton, Mare Nostrum in the different areas where the migrants come in over the sea. And but of course the burden, the financial cost, and the management is dealt with then by the states who put them into place. Italy, mainly Italy, but also Spain. Some Spain missions as well. And this explains. I mean, if you take Italy, can explain also how the Italians become fed up with this situation in the end, and this idea that they have to pay for on their own. Nobody else pays for the problem of the migrants, and that they then become voters of the extreme right or extreme left-wing political parties which brought the current Italian government into power. Now, the Wir schaffen das problem was the following. Angela Merkel, probably out of a humanitarian sentiment, said that the migrants could come to Germany, that they could come, that they would be able to come. And so this meant that it was done in a humanitarian objective, but it actually posed a big problem for all the EU treaties, because it literally suspended the Dublin Treaty, because what the Hungarians did at the time, that they opened the borders, and so all migrants were no longer dealt with or stopped at the external state. They were flowing in, and then via Austria arrived in Bavaria. And so, so this meant, first of all, that the flow of migrants was shifted from the Mediterranean into the so-called Balkan route, and they flowed in massively from there. And there were there was no longer any control or coordination between the member states of the European Union regarding this massive inflow in 2015. In August, it was in August 2015, and to a point where even the Germans were incapable of managing the inflow. And it meant for the border policies that the two tools that you have, the conventions, Dublin and Schengen, both were put into question, both of them. The Schengen means that some states, following the migration crisis, but also the terrorist crisis, because the pictures you see here are more pictures, not only migration problems, also the terrorist crisis in France especially, had the consequence that some member states put back border controls, internal border controls, inside the European Union, in order to be able to manage this inflow of migrants. And for France also, because this is very important, also the migrant is forcibly also a terrorist, because 2015 also coincides with the terrorist crisis, especially in France. So you have the conclusion in the population that the terrorist crisis, yes, this is because there's the migration crisis and the terrorist will be the migrant, which is not true at all, because all the terrorists of the assaults had come from within the Schengen area. So it may be a migrant background from generations, but not somebody coming in following the crisis in Syria, for example. But so this is all mixed up in the public opinion, but it means that some member states put it back in the controls. And yeah, I just wanted to put an emphasis on this terrorist crisis at the same time, because for the French, for example, the migration crisis is not at all talked about a lot. They focus mainly on the problem of the terrorist crisis. And the French have been very careful not to put an emphasis on the migrant crisis, but their policy was keep quiet and take as little migrants as you can. That was their policy with regard to migrant crisis. So there were the member states of the European Union who openly refused to take migrants, but France didn't do so. But they kept quiet, but they didn't increase the acceptance of migrants. They were occupied with the terrorist crisis, but the effect was the same. They put back the border controls. The frequent border controls since 2000 not as such a problem, because the Schengen Agreement allows for temporary putting back into place of border controls if there is an exceptional situation. So you are allowed within the Schengen Agreement to put back the border controls, but only temporarily. And the question is, how long is temporarily? And for the French, temporarily means just up until now. So that's, since 2015. This is pushing the temporality a little bit far, and it means that that puts a question mark then to the Schengen Agreement. What does it mean, exceptional situations, and to put back the border controls? They, for example, in Austria, they put back border controls to stop the flow of migrants, but they, what the Austrians sometimes did, and also the Bavarians, actually they did that in agreement with each other, they put back the controls and then lifted them again and then put them back. So they have not violated the Schengen Agreement, but in a sense it was also a response which goes against the spirit of the Schengen Agreement, which is open borders. So what it shows, this response, is that we have a partial suspension of the Schengen Agreement. This is not putting to question the agreement as such, but it shows a lack of a European response. I mean, some member states put back border controls, others don't. And they do it in function of their own national interest or of their own political aims. For example, French authorities put back the border controls in order to show that they are capable of dealing with a terrorist crisis. They know very well, if you go to Strasbourg and Kiel, I like always to mention this, is you have 4 bridges between Strasbourg and Kiel. And if you close the bridge, the car bridge, you can just imagine yourself in your head the terrorists coming over on the pedestrian bridge and saying hello, because you don't. If you just control one bridge, you don't. You can't actually efficiently control. Put back the border controls, because you don't have the manpower to do it, and you don't have you don't even have the technology to do it. You can't. I mean, you can't do it systematically anyway. So in fact, this measure was purely political. In fact, but it was very efficient, because in the hands of the people of Strasbourg, suddenly the bad guys definitely came from Germany. And this is also historical consequences to it, because it was not only the bad terrorist who might be a migrant, but also the bad German who used to be bad in history and maybe becomes bad again now. So this is what we call the ressentiment. All this is spurred off with this border control putting into place. And the fact that it's not efficient, you can see that best between Sweden and Denmark. They put back border controls following the migration crisis. And they have so many cross-border workers that after 3 weeks they had to abandon that policy, because the cross-border workers just couldn't get it to work. It was completely disrupting the labor market, and so they couldn't keep it up. And what it does, so after the migration crisis, the Schengen rules were renegotiated. They have still not come to a conclusion of this renegotiation of the Schengen Agreement. They don't really know how to resolve this problem. How long and why, and under which circumstances, and how can you put back border controls. And but it has also questioned this idea of Europe without borders. And this is really worrying me as a convinced European, is that the consequence was to say, especially for the political parties who are Eurosceptical, because of all this, your European project doesn't work. It's the fault of European integration. The whole EU doesn't function. And the best example is, of course, Brexit for this. And so the migration crisis has caused a lot of internal problems for the Europeans, which are in relation with the migrants. But the migrant is not even the only issue of this, because I just talked about the cross-border workers. They're not forcibly migrants. So it's this migration crisis has questioned the whole idea of this borderless Europe inside the European Union. And what are now the consequences for the asylum and migration policies? Well, the 2015 crisis has definitely suspended the Dublin Agreement, it started actually not with the Hungarians but with the Czech Republic first suspended it. And this means that this principle, first entry principle, was not necessarily no longer respected. The whole problem of the Dublin Agreement is not necessarily the fact that the asylum seekers have to be dealt with, which is also, of course, costly and which you have to organize at the external border, but it's also what to do with them afterwards. That is the question. So how to dispatch them among the member states of the European Union. And for this, the migration crisis was in fact a little bit positive, because it put the point on the vulnerable part of Dublin that there was no system of quotas, how to dispatch asylum seekers among the member states of the European Union. And the Dublin Agreement has been renegotiated, as said, also we are already at the 4th edition. But even the 4th edition, which is the most recent one, does not foresee a quota system, because there is opposition in the European Council. You need unanimity for this, and the Visegrad countries, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic refuse this quota system. They refuse to accept quotas of migrants. And as long as they don't accept this, you cannot coherently reform the Dublin system. And this leads then to the necessity for the European Union to have the externalization and the treaties with external states, because their own system is no longer well functioning. Okay, I will maybe skip. Of course, I mean, the migration crisis has amplified the number of migrants or asylums in the European Union very quickly in a very short time. This has also put a lot of pressure on the member states then, once the migrants come in, how to deal with them, because you have to let them come in via the borders, but once they arrive in the countries, then you have to also see how to integrate them, how to deal with them, how to do all the procedures of seeing whether they can get a status of refugee status, whether they are allowed, whether they have to be lodged, they have to be fed. So all these practical issues which are very important. This was, of course, a huge problem for Germany, where a lot of migrants, and for Sweden also, the countries which let in most of the migrants. And when with all these refugee seekers coming in, we had I have observed throughout all our contributions in our network with Emmanuel, 3 types of reactions. I've called this the welcoming countries. This is frequently used. Welcoming countries, as an example, Germany or Sweden. Especially Germany, of course, will say, okay, we accept these refugees are welcome in our states, and even invite them to come in. Then we have the so-called, I call them the status quo countries, which do not advocate that they will take in more migrants, but which keep their policies, their usual policy in place. They don't have a negative answer. I would put Austria a little bit aside, and the UK in the sense that their migration policies have not changed, but in Austria, for example, they have put back the border controls, the Schengen, and the new government, or which has already fallen again, of Kurz, has of course tried to then, once he was in place, influence migrant policies in order to give less beneficial conditions for migrants. So they are Austria is not so much status quo any longer. The UK is probably status quo. As I said, they were never concerned by the Schengen space anyhow, but they used this migrant issue as a strong point for the Brexit. And so this has probably also caused some change of mind of the population, of the British population, with regard to this issue. And then the refusal countries, and this is quite surprising, are in fact countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, who actually said no, but openly said it, we don't want any migrants. And their argument for this, or we will derive, their argument is actually based on values, or on national identity values. They say we don't. These migrants are not Christian, for example. They say they don't. They are Muslims, and therefore we don't want them. We don't want any Muslims in our state. So they actually do say it openly, and so they base this on a kind of identity. And this is, of course, very, very criticable, because it's just, this doesn't go together with the idea of the European Union, that you are unified in diversity. It's just a complete violation of that principle. When you say we don't want you because you are Muslims, I mean, this is not a possibility, but they openly say it, and they refuse, therefore, the quotas, and they're the refusal countries, and they come from the Eastern, the ex-communist bloc. And you can then, this is a whole research strand you can start on why do these countries especially refuse it. And I have my idea on this, thinking that these countries have been pushed into this European integration process very quickly. They have had 40 years of a communist rule, where you did not have a lot of exchange with other populations. The borders were very close, even within the so-called communist brother states. And I think they are just not used to this idea of European integration. They wanted to quickly get into the European Union for economic reasons, and so they end up, maybe this is one explanation, but it has to be tested, of course. The welcoming countries, what is, like Germany or Sweden, what is really worrying about them is that following the inflow of the migrants, they finish by adopting more restrictive migration policies for the financial support, for because for 2 reasons. Because first of all, it's a financial pressure, of course, and secondly, the population in these states, including Germany, is not always as welcoming as the politicians, and so they quickly get a problem in their country, and so they end up restricting the benefits in order to avoid more refugees to come in, and also to show the population, hey, we are not so favorable towards migrants, because the governments always have to be re-elected. And the status quo countries, they have more reacted in the sense of what I've already demonstrated, putting back border controls in order to avoid an inflow, a supplementary inflow of migrants, which they did not want and did not agree to. But they do not, they have so far, apart from maybe Austria, not really changed their migration policies because they have not accepted so many new migrants into their countries. And well, I think I wanted to make a point about the UK, because 2016 is just 1 year after, or not even a year after, when the Brexit campaign starts. And in fact, the Brexiters take up this whole problem, this whole crisis of the European Union, and make it in a sense worse, because they use it to argue against not only migrants, you can see how the arguments go, but also against the idea of the European Union. So this is where the crisis actually affects also the European integration process, because they say, yeah, if you stay in the European Union, that means you're welcoming towards migrants. The refusal countries, and this is really horrible, in a sense, they put up new fences and walls. Yeah, they built, actually, they have constructed these, countries have constructed fences and walls against the entry of migrants. And I remember one of our Hungarian colleagues who was responsible for cross-border population saying, this is really sad, we were the first in Hungary to open the Iron Curtain in 1989. And we are the first ones to put back these fences following the migrant crisis for a different reason, but still you can see the reaction is not all Hungarians agree with their government on this subject. We always have to be careful about this, because there are a lot of these people in these Visegrad countries who also don't agree with the policies of their governments. Now, concerning the legislations at stake, Schengen and Dublin, you have to see that the crisis has actually led to a disequilibrium of how many migrants are in which state. And in fact, those states who have adopted more migrants, like for example Germany, are more dependent now on the solution for the agreements, Dublin, mainly Dublin, to have a quota system. Germany has been pushing very much in favor of this quota system because they were more confronted with the problem. So this has actually a little bit changed the situation with regard to 2010, where Germans were not concerned with the problem. So the migrants were in Greece and in Italy, whereas in 2015, following this migration crisis, you have member states who are then now more concerned, and who are, so it's more the Germans who've been pushing for this revision of the Dublin Agreement with a system of quotas, then, and of course supported also by Italians and Greek, has changed the situation of inside the member states. And the migration crisis has also showed the point to which you have a lack of solidarity among member states, meaning that the Hungarians, the Poles, said to the Germans very clearly, it was all over the press, you let them in, you deal with them. And so it's not considered to be there, but this is not being showing solidarity. But you can see that already in 2010, when the migrants were coming into Italy or Greece, nobody, it was a problem of Greece and Italy, but it was not, it was a European problem. And so if you look a little bit more from a, I would say, global perspective to this migrant crisis in Europe, the Europeans, they criticize very much the policies of Trump and the wars against Mexico. But if you look at some of the member states in the European Union and you see these pictures, which are not at the Mexican-US border, but in Europe, you can also blame the Europeans for not having better solution than Donald Trump to this issue. And the whole idea, this is an old idea of the fortress Europe, is of Europe where only nobody can come in. It's not something very compatible with the ideal of European integration. Thank you very much.